The Xbox 360, Microsoft's most successful game console, has turned 20, and to celebrate, we're rewinding back to November 2005 to embrace the Xbox 360 Day 1 experience. The 360 represents Microsoft at their very best, with a slew of game-changing features which would forever alter the industry, for better or for worse. With its sleek white shell, the 360 kicked off one of the longest console generations in history. And of course, we know how it ends, but going back to the beginning helps us better appreciate what the team was trying to accomplish when the system launched in 2005. In this two-part series, I'll be guiding you through the lead-up and release of Xbox 360, while covering every single Xbox 360 launch game, including regional exclusives and the complete Day 1 Xbox Live Arcade library of games. And we'll be doing all of this on a 2005 launch model that was only just opened for this video. So, let's dive into the world of Xbox 360. When Microsoft stepped into the console arena in 2001 with the original Xbox, it was met with skepticism. The company had deep roots in PC gaming, of course, but consoles were a different beast, a tightly contested space dominated by seasoned players. Still, just 4 years later after its arrival, the original Xbox managed to carve out a respectable foothold. Halo was a phenomenon. Xbox Live redefined online play for console gaming, and the hardware, it was the most powerful of the generation. Yet despite these wins, the PlayStation 2 reigned supreme. Microsoft faced mounting challenges in reducing the cost of its bulky PC-like Xbox hardware, a problem that would shape its next move. Behind the scenes, the team began work on a successor. No compromises. The result was a sleek, white machine with a concave silhouette, a stark contrast to the original's industrial heft. For graphics, Microsoft partnered with ATI to develop the Xenos GPU, a bold, forward-looking design featuring unified shaders and embedded DRAM. These innovations weren't just ahead of their time, they directly influenced ATI's future terascale architecture, paving the way for scalable, parallel graphics processing. The CPU, meanwhile, was a PowerPC tri-core chip co-developed with IBM, a cousin to the Cell processor Sony was building for PlayStation 3. But where Cell relied on a single core with multiple SPUs, Xbox 360 opted for 3 symmetrical cores, offering developers a more familiar and flexible programming model. In March 2005, a website known as OurColony.net started to gain traction in gaming spaces. It turned out to be an alternate reality game, leading up to the reveal of Xbox 360, similar to Bungie's I Love Bees campaign. That official reveal would occur on May 12, 2005. MTV presents the next generation Xbox revealed. The event was hosted by Elijah Wood and features a tease of the Xbox 360 console mixed with live musical performances, Jay Allard talking about building a new console, and some Pimp My Ride action. It's a weird mishmash of 2005 era pop culture and gaming, but ultimately it's just a tease of the new console. At least we got Wall Guy out of this event. This was just one of many screenshots that Microsoft sent out after announcing Perfect Dark Zero, but the internet sort of picked up on this one. It's supposed to be a dude taking cover behind this wall, but instead it just looks like a flat texture, and as a result it became sort of a proto-internet meme for a bit there. In retrospect, this is the exact sort of problem that ambient occlusion would address just a couple years later. Thankfully, the proper reveal occurred not long after, at E3 2005. Microsoft confidently presented a vision for the next generation with a show lasting over 1 hour, showcasing a wide range of software including upcoming Japanese exclusives such as Dead or Alive 4 and Lost Odyssey. It was an impressive showcase that helped set the stage for what was to come. But for those that were around during this era, you might also remember that 2005 was the year Sony unveiled PlayStation 3. Opposite Microsoft, the PS3 dazzled the audience with trailers that looked far beyond what Microsoft was promising. The problem is, most of it was pre-rendered CGI. So while Sony had buzz coming out of E3, Microsoft had something tangible.
Xbox 360 is here, and it's on.
The months leading up to launch were filled with buzz, culminating in August when Microsoft revealed pricing: $399 for the premium model and $299 for the core system, a system which lacked a hard drive and shipped only with composite video cables and a wired controller. On November 22nd, the Xbox 360 reached North American store shelves. I didn't experience the launch firsthand until a few weeks later when the system arrived in Tokyo. Microsoft rolled out the red carpet there, aiming to win over the Japanese players with some big names. But in 2005, the console debuted with a huge selection of games, both retail discs and Xbox Live Arcade titles. Day one buyers also encountered the most robust console interface to date, the Blades as they were called. Even today, using a brand new system that we just opened for this video, we can experience them in 2025. The Blades remain striking. The design, while unmistakably 2005, is clean, free of advertisements, and runs at a smooth 60 frames per second without any stutter or slowdown. The thing to keep in mind is that as of 2005, most console operating systems were very simple. You had menus for adjusting very basic system settings, save game management, and more. They were often fun to look at, but it wasn't something you would spend a lot of time in. When you look at what was possible in, say, the Mega CD, it's not actually that different from what you could do on, say, the original Xbox. Manage your saves, play music, and the like. Xbox 360, however, was a big jump forward. You had all these different tabs associated with different types of activities, games, media, etc. There were stores on there where you could buy digital games. You could interface with your PC and Xbox Live and just do a whole lot more. Plug in a USB stick or an old iPod and you can play MP3s directly from the dashboard. You can also pop in a music CD if you like. Music playback's even possible during gameplay, though it lacks the seamless custom soundtrack integration of the original Xbox. If you're just up for some listening though, you can enjoy the music visualizer created by none other than Jeff Minter himself, a nice touch. Overall, the Xbox 360 experience at launch was pure console gaming bliss and the last of its kind for Microsoft. Pop in a disc and it played. There's no updates, no patches, nothing, it just works. The launch lineup then featured more than 20 games per region, with some exclusive to Xbox Live Arcade. For this series of videos, I've broken them into categories. First-party titles published by Microsoft, Japanese-developed titles, sports and extreme sports games, games derived from prior generation consoles like Xbox or PlayStation 2, PC conversions, and of course, XBLA titles. On this first installment, we'll be taking a look at first-party games, Japanese-developed games, and PC-adjacent games. So, let's begin with the first-party lineup. For my money, Microsoft's standout day one title is Project Gotham Racing 3, PGR3. The original PGR launched alongside the first Xbox, so it feels fitting that a sequel would usher in the next generation. And of all the games available at launch, this is arguably the most visually impressive. Several key elements combine to achieve this effect. Firstly, the team at Bizarre Creations did a remarkable job at modeling the environments. Tokyo, London, Las Vegas, and more are all here and beautifully rendered. Despite arriving before the era of physically based materials, texture quality and architectural detail are a huge step up beyond anything seen on prior generation consoles. This of course applies to the cars themselves, which are significantly more detailed. Lighting and reflections lend them a convincing presence, with certain finishes, such as bright red paint, still popping vividly today. The combination of highly detailed vehicles and beautifully realized tracks defines the PGR aesthetic. But two technical features elevate the presentation even further. The first is per-pixel motion blur. Now I know, motion blur certainly divides opinions, but when well implemented, it can look fantastic, simulating the behavior of a camera lens or even the natural blur of our eyes at speed. Compare this to its prequel, PGR2, which runs at the same frame rate but lacks motion blur. The result is stuttery, a less fluid presentation. In 2005, per-pixel motion blur was truly cutting edge, enabled specifically by the new hardware, and this game shows it off beautifully. The second major innovation is an internal HDR rendering pipeline. This is not display-based HDR that we talk about these days, but rather floating point buffers storing lighting values beyond the standard 0 to 1 range, which means bright lights and reflections can exceed pure white, producing a more natural look. Tone mapping then compresses these values into something that displays of the era could actually handle, dynamically adjusting exposure depending on whether you're in sunlight or shadow. It mimics the human eye's adaptation to light, really. Occasionally, the tone mapper can be a little aggressive, leaving the image dimmer than intended, but overall the effect is convincing. Unfortunately, there are some compromises. The game only runs at 30 frames per second, like PGR2 before it, a disappointment given that pre-release trailers were uploaded at 60, suggesting a return to the higher frame rate of the original game. Plus, the resolution falls short of the promised 720p, landing instead at 1024 by 600, a precedent that, unfortunately, many Xbox 360 titles would follow. Even so, PGR3 remains a true showpiece for the system, packed with events, races, and tracks, supported by a massively varied soundtrack. It delivered one of the most enjoyable racing experiences of its era. For 2005, it was an incredible way to kick off the 360. Up next, two launch titles from legendary developer Rare: Perfect Dark Zero and Kameo, Elements of Power. By 2005, Rare was just 3 years into its Microsoft era, having already shipped 2 original Xbox games before the 360 arrived. Perfect Dark Zero followed the N64 Classic, released 5 years earlier. Initially prototyped on Nintendo GameCube, it shifted to the original Xbox instead, and was reportedly about a year from completion when development shifted to Xbox 360. With the third Halo game still years away, Microsoft positioned Perfect Dark Zero as its marquee launch shooter, complete with a full campaign and robust Xbox Live multiplayer. This is one of the games I picked up on day one, and I liked it, but my feelings are mixed. It's simply a game that feels as if it wasn't quite ready to ship. Mission design and map layouts were often confusing, but rather than refining the level design itself, Rare put in these giant arrows guiding the players where to go. The story also feels disjointed and tonally at odds with the original. It's good, but not great, and not on par with its predecessor, let alone Halo. What it did deliver, however, was a technical showcase for the new hardware. The standout feature, parallax mapping. Suddenly, flat textures such as bricks and metal could exhibit real depth, tricking the eye into believing every surface was individually modeled out. At the time, it was a striking demonstration of what Xbox 360 could do. It also features tons of pixel shader effects on surfaces, god rays from the sun designed to give the impression of volumetric lighting, excellent per pixel motion blur, and more. Plus, the animation was very smooth, and it all felt very next-gen at the time, even if some of the artistic decisions are a bit iffy. Unfortunately, all of this tech came at a cost: the frame rate. It's just not good enough, with performance regularly slipping below 30 frames per second, despite running under 720p, coming in around 648p instead. It also suffers from near constant screen tearing whenever the frame rate dips, which is something we'd have to become used to that generation. So while it showcased cool tech, the performance problems, arguably a series staple, hurt the experience. But thankfully, if you play it in backwards compatibility on modern systems, it's much better. Kameo Elements of Power, on the other hand, is a far more polished example, with a smoother frame rate and plenty of cool tech. It lacks the motion blur of PDZ, but it does bring parallax textures to the table, meaning you get that same cool 3D surface effect. But in reality, it's very comparable to the original Xbox version, which was nearly completed, a leaked build of which is out there for you to play right now. The main improvements are the shift to HD resolution, the massive open field with huge enemy counts, and the aforementioned parallax textures. But otherwise, it feels like a game that very much could and did exist on the original Xbox. As a game though, it definitely feels like a Rare title from the N64 era. A character action adventure with the ability to transform into various creatures to solve puzzles and challenges. Like Perfect Dark Zero before it, Kameo also started life on the Nintendo GameCube. This early GameCube prototype differs significantly from the final game, both in terms of visual design and gameplay. You'll also note at this early stage in development, the game is targeting 60 frames per second, which is cool. Obviously though, the game didn't make enough progress to ship and would eventually be shifted over to the Xbox, where it was nearly completed before being shifted over to Xbox 360 instead. Which I do think was the right move given the visual upgrades we're seeing here. It definitely looks a lot better. Revisiting the game, I didn't enjoy it as much as I remembered, but there's still a decent little game here. And it's a welcome addition to the 360 launch lineup that shows off the capabilities of the machine nicely. Plus, it actually does manage to hit a smooth 30 frames per second and deliver a true 720p. That said, coming from games like Star Fox Adventures on the GameCube, I kind of feel like this one should have run at 60 frames per second instead, but as we would soon find out, this is a generation of 30 and less. While thematically different then, both Kameo and Perfect Dark Zero feature great soundtracks that at least embody the spirit of pre-Microsoft Rare. The generation honestly seemed pretty bright for the studio, and there would be some awesome Rare games released later, such as Viva Pinata. That is until the Kinect robbed us of years of great Rare games, at least until Sea of Thieves. In terms of critical reception then, Zero managed an 81 average on Metacritic, while Kameo comes in at just 79. Both feel perhaps slightly inflated in retrospect, but hey, they're launch games. So that covers off 3 of the first-party titles then. Can you guess what's next? Well, I was ready to drop AMP3 on this list, but it turns out Microsoft only published the first 2 games, so we'll get to that one later. No, the next game published by Microsoft at launch is a Japanese exclusive created by Game Republic, the studio behind Genji on the PlayStation, founded by ex-Capcom legend Yoshiki Okamoto. Yes, it may lack giant enemy crabs, but Xbox 360 has its very own Game Republic title, and it's called Every Party. This is a Sugoroku-style board game, a board game that has you spinning roulette wheels of which you can hold multiple types to determine how far you can move, occasionally stopping along the way to play some mini games. It all kind of makes sense given that Game Republic also published an actual board game in 2005. The standout feature here though is that Every Party actually features a visual style created by the late Momoko Sakura, the creator of Chibi Maruko-chan. It definitely looks the part, with a very cute visual style that looks excellent in HD. The game features several different modes, but the big focus here seems to be on the story. Yes, there is a story here, and it's an odd one. Basically, you arrive in a mysterious town known as Jinrikikoshi, and immediately notice that it's rather dark and empty. The camera pans around to the side, and suddenly, an old lady appears. She explains that although the town used to be lively, the troubles of the townfolk have begun to stack up, turning it into a dark place, and she needs your help. How do you do that? By playing a round of Every Party, of course. And so it goes. You play through a perfectly fine take on Sugoroku, and that's while following the story as you go. There's also practice and multiplayer modes, as well as the option to just play the mini games with your friends. These types of games were rather popular in Japan, so it made sense to launch with one, and honestly, the game isn't bad at all. Reviews of the time were not super kind though. Famitsu awarded it a 30 out of 40, for instance. On the tech side, however, it makes a nice impression. It's one of the few 360 launch games to run at native 720p with full MSAA at a locked 60 frames per second. It's an example of a game that does exactly what you'd expect, but not a whole lot more. The only real tech issue here is that the loading times can be a little bit lengthy between rounds, but it's otherwise okay. As far as disc-based games are concerned though, this is the last of the Microsoft published titles available at launch, but since it was developed in Japan, let's seamlessly jump into our next category, Japanese developed third-party games. As you may have surmised earlier then, Xbox 360 is the console on which Microsoft poured the most effort into capturing the Japanese market. While ultimately falling short, as we know, the system did have some decent Japanese support. At launch though, there were really just 3 Japanese developed games, Every Party, in addition to Ridge Racer 6 and Tetris, the Grandmaster Ace. Ridge Racer 6 is a game I've covered many times on the channel. It's an awesome evolution of the formula built on the success of the PSP game, but now in HD. The boost system introduced there was expanded, a whole new set of tracks developed, and a smooth 3D engine deployed. The result, a technically conservative but amazingly built racing game with a ton of content. Namco managed a virtually flawless 60 frames per second at 810p. That's right, the resolution was actually above the system's default 720p output, lending the game a slightly downsampled look. Image quality and performance are pristine. Combine that with an extensive single-player mode and a killer soundtrack from Namco's best, and you have one heck of a launch game. It's actually my personal favorite of the 360 launch games, with only Project Gotham Racing 3 coming close. I was surprised to see that this game is sitting at a 74 on Metacritic. One reviewer even specifically called out the game's tech, saying that it was time for Namco to start tinkering under the hood of this old jalopy, especially considering impressive new engines powering games these days. To me, this shows a lack of understanding of the exceptional image quality and performance that Ridge Racer 6 provides. Its conservative approach to graphics allowed it to shine with a high level of performance. The quote-unquote new engines powering games those days could barely reach 30 frames per second. So no, Mr. Game Revolution reviewer, I think time has proven that Namco's approach was the right one. Namco did a decent job supporting Xbox 360 as well over the years. They even had another game promised to launch around this time known as Frame City Killer, which unfortunately was cancelled. The other Japanese launch game, however, is both technically conservative, but also secretly awesome. It's Tetris, the Grandmaster Ace. And yeah, on first glance you might be wondering, really, this is a 360 launch game? Well, let's step back and add some context, shall we? This isn't just Tetris, this is TGM. As I covered back in my Tetris retrospective, TGM is often regarded, at least gameplay-wise, as the ultimate iteration of Tetris. The third game, Terror Instinct, is a true classic, but unfortunately, it's a series that has remained mostly limited to the arcade, which was doubly true in 2005 when there really weren't any other options, which is precisely why it was actually exciting to get a home installment, which is where Ace comes into play. This one is derived from TGM 3, which itself was released in 2005, but Ace makes some changes to the modes and systems that hardcore fans might be a bit iffy on. Rather than climbing to level 999, Ace features modes focused on clearing 150 lines. Arika's grade system also is mostly cut. It features two rotation systems, SRS and ARS, and alters the behavior of hard and soft drops slightly. Worth noting that the Arika rotation system ARS was not initially included in the game. It was added in a patch due to fan complaints. With TGM3 as the basis though, we get very similar visuals, though now in HD, and many shared music tracks, making it feel almost like a home version of TGM3 if not for the design changes. It's not the strongest in the series by any means, but it's still a ton of fun with a fantastic soundtrack. There isn't a lot of coverage out there for this game, but Famitsu Weekly gave it a 25 out of 40, which is pretty low. The big complaints stemmed around the lack of modes, the difficulty, and the fact that it wasn't all that visually impressive. Fair complaints for sure. But in retrospect, with all the patches applied, I do think it's a pretty good game. A very unassuming launch game, but one worth checking out even today. As far as Japanese developed retail games at launch then, this was it, just these 3 games. But honestly, it wouldn't be long before we'd start seeing other great games from Japanese studios. For our next chapter, however, we're going to begin exploring the Xbox 360's bread and butter. With the original Xbox, Microsoft set out to fuse PC gaming with console gaming, and they partially succeeded, but the hardware and displays used weren't quite up to snuff yet. With Xbox 360 and the shift to HD, however, it became more of a reality and the lines started to blur. So this section is focused on games with more of a PC background. To understand what I'm talking about though, we have to rewind all the way back to Quake. So the original Quake came out and changed gaming forever, right? And one of the ways in which it shaped the future of games is the Quake engine and the sheer volume of licensees that would follow. One of those companies, Ritual Entertainment as it was known, was formed by members of 3D Realms and Apogee, among others, and their first product was a mission pack for Quake known as Scourge of Armagon. It was a success, and with this experience, they then licensed the Quake engine, before switching to the Quake 2 engine, by the way, a couple months later, and set out to work on their own original game known as Sin. With its initially buggy release and proximity to Half-Life, however, Sin didn't make a huge impact at the time, at least not as much as they had hoped, but it seemingly did well enough to warrant an expansion pack. That pack is known as Wages of Sin, and it was developed by a ragtag team of modders who came together to create a professional retail quality add-on. And it was good, and even pushed people to revisit the game, helping gamers realize that Sin was kind of a Quake engine follow-up to Duke Nukem 3D style shooters in many ways. Still with me here? Okay, good. So the development of Wages of Sin was handled by a company known as 2015 Inc., and they took a few smaller projects after shipping it, including something called Laser Arena, but their big break came shortly after they were tapped to create a new title in the still fresh Medal of Honor franchise. You know, Steven Spielberg and EA had famously collaborated to create this series on the original PlayStation, and 2015 were given the chance to bring that franchise to the PC. The result? Medal of Honor Allied Assault, a game that changed the perception of what a first-person shooter could be. It presented a deeply scripted experience designed to depict huge events, including the storming of Omaha Beach. While it found success, the development team had grievances with its publisher EA, and with the help of Activision, key figures departed 2015 to form their own studio. Stop me if you've heard the name before. They were called Infinity Ward. The rest is history. Infinity Ward's very first game was known as Call of Duty, and it found huge success. But they also ran into a problem. You see, it was a PC game, and bringing that PC game to consoles at the time wasn't really feasible. So other studios were tapped to create console iterations of the game, including yet another studio you might know, Treyarch. You see where we're going with this, right? Well, this is where Xbox 360 enters the picture. With the promise of hardware capable of standing toe-to-toe with PCs of the era, suddenly, games like Call of Duty could be created simultaneously for PC and consoles. Enter Call of Duty 2. Developed by Infinity Ward, Call of Duty 2 is the true sequel to the original and the beginning of the franchise's rise to prominence. Following up Call of Duty, the sequel promises even larger scale action with bigger set pieces, and as promised, the Xbox 360 version delivers the PC experience in the living room. That's right, from visuals to multiplayer and beyond, Call of Duty 2 truly delivered the full-fat PC experience to home console players, and it was available on day one. This is arguably one of the most important games to launch alongside the 360, and one whose legacy would ultimately change the trajectory of AAA gaming for years to come. But perhaps it didn't feel quite that big at the time. You see, in 2005, Call of Duty really didn't have the cachet of Halo, Half-Life, Doom, and the like. It was an up-and-coming player. Yet, it planted the seeds and did a lot of things right out of the gate. The campaign takes place across multiple fronts, telling the story from different perspectives, lending the game even more variety than its predecessor. Now, one of the biggest things that this series brought to the table then is the focus on aiming down sights using a controller. It's something that had existed prior, but the way Call of Duty handles this specifically, left trigger to aim, right trigger to shoot, would become the standard for shooters going forward, and it feels great here. Tech-wise, Call of Duty 2 also marks the beginning of Infinity Ward's own in-house evolution of the Quake 3 engine. While their prior projects largely used Quake as is, IW 2.0 as it was known, features a lot of major changes to the underlying Quake 3 technology necessary to support its expanded game design. The new engine adds a lot of features. It's now DirectX 9 capable, supports modern normal maps, complex texture effects, and bloom. You got heat haze effects for fire, increased density and quality of foliage, and more. It was also the beginning of their console push, and Xbox 360 marked the beginning. Even more important, Call of Duty 2 marked the beginning of a very bold choice for this generation, the decision to aim for 60 frames per second. This generation would become notorious for low frame rates, struggling even to reach 30 FPS, but with this game and all future Call of Duty titles, Infinity Ward really wanted to get that 60 FPS target down. Unfortunately, in this first installment, they couldn't quite pull it off. You see, Call of Duty 2 is very CPU heavy, and as a result, it really struggles. While 60 FPS is achieved during quiet moments, the second you fire your weapon and engage the enemy, the frame rate starts to drop all the way down to 30 FPS due to the double buffer VSync. As a result, it feels very inconsistent to play from a modern perspective. I respect the push for 60 frames per second, but clearly they weren't quite ready for it yet, but they would get there in time. PC players, however, faced very much the same thing. Using a 7800 GTX powered system, one of Nvidia's most powerful graphics card released mere months before 360, the game also struggles to reach 60 FPS even at 1024x768. It's just a very heavy game. Thankfully, Infinity Ward did achieve their objective in bringing a high-end PC game to the console space. The 360 version compares very favorably without any major sacrifices. They didn't need to chop up the levels, reduce visual quality, or anything like that. It feels exactly like Call of Duty 2 running on a relatively high-end 2005 era PC. Quite an accomplishment, even with the rough edges. Call of Duty then would go on to become a phenomenon, after the release of the fourth game anyway, but its legacy on consoles started here. As for the game itself, I have to admit, it has aged worse than I expected. I respect what they've accomplished, but it's so scripted, and shooting at small targets across the map with a gamepad doesn't feel great. I really didn't enjoy many of the missions in replaying this. Classic games such as Halo, Half-Life 2, Doom 3 and the like have all aged much better in my opinion. Toss the Master Chief in a square room with a bunch of enemies and you'll still have a good time, but with Call of Duty 2, I'd argue that's not the case. That said, I do think it plays better on the PC with a mouse and keyboard. Thankfully, Infinity Ward would greatly improve the game controller feel in time, but Call of Duty 2 didn't quite pull it off. But you never guess that if you looked at reviews, where the game currently sits at an 89 on Metacritic. I knew the game was well received at the time, but holy heck. These reviews, however, do successfully convey how hungry people were for a different sort of first-person shooter, and Call of Duty 2 was indeed that sort of game. So while I think the formula is tired and Call of Duty 2 itself now feels rather dated, the promise was still there, and Call of Duty 2 rightfully deserves its place in history. But Activision didn't stop with Call of Duty. They also released Quake 4, developed by Raven Software, another studio that would be relegated to the Call of Duty mines in time. Quake 4, however, stems from a moment when they were still forging their own destiny, and this time they were given a chance to tackle the legendary Quake franchise. The result? An awesome, massively underrated shooter. In fact, of all the first-person shooters released alongside Xbox 360, this is my favorite one. The gunplay, level design, pacing, and storytelling are all still fantastic, even to this day. It genuinely feels great to play, even on a gamepad. The feedback from every weapon, it's excellent. There's just one problem. The Xbox 360 version itself kinda sucks. Okay, maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but here we go. Quake 4 is the second game to ship using id Tech 4, the engine developed for Doom 3. By the launch of Xbox 360, Doom 3 was just over 1 year old, and still considered a fairly high-end PC game. The big feature of id Tech 4 was, of course, the inclusion of a unified lighting model, allowing all objects and environmental bits to cast real-time stencil shadows. In addition, all lights are real-time. There's nothing baked here. It's a very dynamic presentation. The result is honestly breathtaking for 2004, and Quake 4 features all of this, and more. On Xbox 360, however, the game runs fully unlocked with double buffer VSync, and the results are exceptionally unstable. It can reach a height of 60 FPS in rare instances, but can also drop into the teens. These wild fluctuations ensure that the game never really feels especially smooth or consistent. On PCs of the era, systems with much less powerful graphics cards ran the game better than Xbox 360, suggesting that it might be CPU limited. Later id Tech 4 games on 360 would perform a lot better, so it feels like this one just wasn't optimized in time for launch. And it's a shame because, performance aside, the game looks great and features excellent image quality. It's a full 1280 by 720, and unlike the PC original, natively supports widescreen with a HUD to match. This should have been an awesome release, but the performance just lets it down big time. It's a real shame that Microsoft never offered this one on backwards compatibility for future Xbox consoles, as, thanks to the unlocked frame rate, it would likely have just run at 60 FPS. But since it's not available there, you should at least check out the PC version if you've never played it before. What's interesting though, is that the Xbox 360 version of Quake 4 shipped with a second disc right in the package, a copy of Quake 2. That's right, Quake 2 was ported to the 360 by one Brian Harris, who I actually spoke to many years ago when writing an article on Digital Foundry. The reason? A very special trick. Quake 2 is the very first full HD 1080p console game. But nobody was aware of this at the time. You see, at least based on my testing, it wasn't really possible to achieve 1080p on the Xbox 360 at launch. I tested both component cables and VGA cables, and 1080p simply wasn't an option with any combination of cables. But the 360 did eventually allow 1080p output, and since the game reads the resolution from the system level, it just runs at 1080p 60. Even the developer didn't really know this would happen at the time, but here it is. Very cool, right? As for Quake 4 itself though, as I said, it's a great game from Raven that carved out its own take on the Quake franchise, but ultimately it's not great on Xbox 360 due to poor performance. And this is reflected in the reviews, where the game largely scored much lower on Xbox 360 due in part to these performance issues. The PC version is generally regarded as the much better game. It is weird though that Call of Duty 2 wasn't really dinged for its also severe performance issues, but oh well. Still, even with the disappointing performance, it's not a bad launch game, and definitely was worth checking out on day one. Next up on our list, however, we have yet another PC-derived experience, sort of. This is Condemned Criminal Origins from Monolith Productions and Sega. Yes, that Monolith, not the studio behind Xenoblade. Monolith Productions has a rich history on the PC, but very little representation on consoles. The Xbox 360 would change this. So like Quake 4 and Call of Duty 2, Condemned is also rooted in PC technology, namely the Lithtech Jupiter EX engine. It was developed simultaneously along with Fear, a game which had just released on the PC 1 month prior. The objective in both cases was to create a world with full dynamic lighting, similar to id Tech 4, but with an even more advanced set of features. Condemned shows them off well. Parallax occlusion maps are used throughout. Volumetric lighting is used to great effect. There's very cool post-processing and depth of field effects here. Condemned itself shares a lot of visual commonalities with Fear, but is focused more on dingy underground locales as opposed to the office complex horror we saw in Fear. It also focuses almost entirely on melee combat as opposed to guns, with fights demanding the player to defend and attack using whatever random weapons they can find lying around usually. But there's a twist: the investigation tools. These are used to piece together clues that you find during play, and all of them feature very cool visual flourishes. Condemned was ported to PC just 6 months later or so, and when you see them side by side, it really shows the strengths of the 360 platform, as it looks virtually identical. The main difference we picked up on here is that the 360 version exhibits some slight black crush, which was something that often plagued the system, especially in its early days due to the weird gamma setup. But it was still excellent to see an engine like this running so well on a game console. Alas, while the game is a nice visual showpiece for 360, there's a couple issues with it that stand out. Firstly, Monolith, like many other developers that we've covered today, made a strange decision when it comes to performance. Namely, it runs without a frame rate cap again, and is very unstable. So while it does actually mostly run at 30 frames per second, there's plenty of dips below that, and even occasional spikes up to 60, which means it doesn't feel all that consistent as a result. but it's a lot better than games like Quake 4. Secondly, and this isn't really Monolith's fault, Condemned launched at a time when people were making the jump to flat panel displays, especially LCDs, and flat panels circa 2005 could not display black at all. Thus, dark games like Condemned, Doom 3, and the like wound up looking really bad on popular HD displays and LCD monitors of the era. I remember buying my first plasma TV back then and being shocked by how much worse Condemned looked on the thing versus a CRT, and plasmas were largely superior to LCDs in terms of black level performance already. I do feel that for a while the shift to flat panels had a very negative effect on the creation of horror games, because no longer could you rely on complete darkness to convey atmosphere, because you'd just wind up with a face full of backlight. But there's one more note here on the performance I wanted to mention. I tested all of these games in 480p just for good measure, and found that each of them downsample from a higher resolution, and thus you get no boost in performance. But keep this in mind for our next game. Still, despite that wonky performance, the game does indeed run a lot better than Quake 4, and is very playable even today. While a little repetitive in terms of level design, Condemned was still a very cool Xbox 360 launch game, and was exclusive for the first 6 months of its life even. In terms of reception, Condemned did pretty well. Reviews average out to around 81 according to Metacritic, and the game would go on to receive a sequel. But with these 3 first-person games under our belt, it's time to talk about something a little different. A series that has history both on PC and consoles dating back to the mid-90s. I'm talking about Need for Speed, and EA was there on day one with a brand new installment known as Most Wanted.
First, I'm gonna take your ride, then I'm gonna take your girl. Get ready for that.
And you know, this one really holds up well. It harkens back to one of the best eras in Need for Speed history, with a perfect blend between tightly designed races and an open world. Most Wanted is a continuation of the design first established in Need for Speed Underground 2. That is, the game takes place in and around a sizable open world map, but also features a lot of bespoke events within that, without making it feel like a sandbox style of game that we would see today. It's a nice middle ground. Basically, you're here to take on the Blacklist, the top 15 racers in the area, and to challenge them, you need to complete a bunch of races and events to get their attention, and then you take them down one by one. The objective: Razor Callahan. Oh yeah. I love this style of narrative. Yeah, it's extremely cheesy, but it's also kind of heartfelt and a lot of fun, even today. Now, once you jump in and start playing, Most Wanted still manages to feel great. The cars handle well, the environments are fun to drive, and the events are largely well designed, and there's plenty of police action for those that love it. It was also a hugely multi-platform game, appearing on everything from home consoles, the PC, and even handhelds of the era, so it was difficult to categorize this one. You see, the 360 version is, technically anyways, the most advanced version of the game. EA implemented an entire HDR lighting pipeline into the mix, added more advanced shaders and effects, better shadows, and all kinds of other features created just for the Xbox 360, lending the game a unique look compared to every other version. The baseline visuals for Most Wanted are those found in the PlayStation 2 version. You can see that when we bring in the comparison here, as it is missing a lot of features. There's no dynamic shadows from world geometry, of course, no specular reflections across the tarmac, no pixel shaders in use, obviously, lower resolution textures all around, and a completely different color scheme. One might argue that the Xbox 360 version is perhaps a bit too yellow for its own good, an issue we would see with other games across this generation. But the rest of the visuals and the results are largely improved in terms of what you see on screen. That being said, the last generation version of Need for Speed Most Wanted is still surprisingly impressive. The entire game is there, including the open world stuff. All of the cutscenes and scripting and everything plays out exactly the same between all versions. Only the portable versions really saw any drastic changes, but if you played on PS2 or the original Xbox, it was a close match for the 360 version in terms of the overall experience, which is great. The PC version, on the other hand, is a step above the last generation console versions and sits closer to the Xbox 360 version, though even still, it's rather different. It almost feels like a halfway point between those older consoles and the 360. You do have fully dynamic shadows for the environment, there's a lot of pixel shader effects in play, and everything is just more detailed, including textures. Also, there's no real yellow tint here on the PC version, which might be a benefit. But still, the default Xbox 360 version is decidedly more detailed, especially when looking at the cars up close. Thankfully, there has been some mod work done on the PC version to bring it closer to Xbox 360, if you're interested in booting it up these days. Heck, you can even get it running in ultra-wide if you desire. Still, back in 2005, the Xbox 360 version was arguably the best place to play this game, without a doubt, and it made for an awesome launch title. There's just one issue. The frame rate is rather unstable. It's fully uncapped like many other games, but this time it doesn't use V-Sync, which means that it's kind of all over the place and you encounter a lot of tearing while simply driving around. In this case, I would have preferred a capped 30 FPS for a more consistent experience, at least in HD. You see, remember I mentioned the 480p thing earlier in this video? Well, Most Wanted very specifically is a game that changes its resolution according to system output. So when you boot it up in 480p, the EA HD logo is completely skipped, and the game does indeed run at that lower resolution. The effect of this is a much smoother frame rate though, and it manages to hit mostly 60 FPS. Thus, it's kind of an ironic situation as one of the very first EA HD games winds up running a lot better when specifically not using HD. Oh well. Even with this blemish, the game still remains a joy to play. There's a reason why disc copies of Most Wanted have retained their value. People loved it back in the day, and it's still a ton of fun in the modern era. These days, Need for Speed has lost a lot of its luster, unfortunately, and 2005's Most Wanted sort of harkens back to the day when it was one of the bigger franchises in the world. It's cheesy as heck, but boy, it's a good time. That brings us to the end of this segment and part 1 of the Xbox 360 Digital Foundry experience. Next time, we'll tackle the remaining Xbox 360 library, including all of the XBLA games, including those like Hexic HD, Geometry Wars, and the like. It's all good stuff. Then you have the sports games, where there are some interesting and sometimes funny results, not to mention ports from the PS2 generation of consoles like Tony Hawk and Gun. And if you're hungry for more Xbox 360 and you missed it, Rich and I also did a video showcasing the unboxing of the very Xbox 360 used in this video. So if you want to see it cracked open for the first time, check that video out. But that's going to do it for part 1, so we'll see you next time.